Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe this video for more content on any of your alternative football favorites. Now, on to the show. Joining me today on the Gridiron Gallery podcast, I have a big fan of the show, a huge fan of the show, if you will, someone that's really been giving me a lot of support lately, and I can't thank him enough. It's Greg James, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line podcast, part of CFL America Radio, as well as the Sports History Network of podcasts. Greg, thank you very much for joining the show. Seriously, I appreciate it a lot. I know I've been trying to get you on for a little bit. Finally, things just lined up for myself and, getting you. And first off, thanks for the support. You've been really big online for me, by the way. Second off, how are things with you lately? I understand you from talking to you. You're a Chicago area local. I'm a Chicago sports fan. So how are things up in your area?
They are nice up here. We're going to have 90-degree weather here in a couple days, early tomorrow. So, and no, hey, it's my pleasure. Help, with your podcast and getting the word out about your show. It's for me, it's required listening every week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That means a lot, man. And I'm definitely going to give you a moment of time, of course, later on in the show to, highlight your podcast, that is, of course, and what you do, as well as for the Sports History Podcast Network, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on with those guys as well. For the time being, though, we got some CFL discussion, my man. We got plenty of stuff to talk about. And the Edmonton team themselves added on to that, just basically piled on to what we're already talking about, right? This week. So, let's dive into that. So for those that have been living under a rock, or they aren't in tune with the CFL, the Edmonton, formerly known Edmonton Eskimos, were being referred to as the Edmonton E's for the duration of roughly a year. Last year, they decided to abandon the Eskimo name and started the search for a team name. This was in kind of response to the Cleveland Indians and the Washington football team doing their respective moves and transitions into new names as well. And now they are the first of those three teams to finally lock down a new brand and a new naming. And was revealed as of this recording today that the Edmonton E's are now known as the Edmonton Elks. So it was a highly rumored name. It was one that was a front runner at times, it seemed, for fans. And you have all new branding and all new field, which, by the way, the logo is vertical rather than horizontal. Interesting choice, I would say. We'll get that. And everything else in between has been talked about with this new rebrand. Greg, I know this was kind of something that fell right into our lap as we were getting ready for this show. I mean, do you like the name? I can give you, I definitely want to talk some of the alternatives, but how do you think about the Elks as the choice? The one that was talked about a lot too.
Well, when the news broke, my phone blew up.
Okay.
So
that's a start.
and then it's like Elks. I'm like, okay, well, Elks was my preferred name. In fact, everybody that I know who I'm friends with up in Edmonton were like, yeah, Elks. Mm-hmm. They were kicking around other names, but none of them just really seemed to fit. What were some of them?
So here's what I've got with the names. So the preferred ones, of course, this is ESPN's write-up for it. Yeah, the Evergreens, the Evergolds, the Eclipse, the Elk Hounds, the Eagles, and the Elements. The Elements one is such a dud.
Well, there was another one in there that they'd kicked around years ago called Empire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but that one, because that kind of harkens back when that whole area of the country of Canada was part of the Empire.
I see.
Part of the British Empire. So
okay, that could fit. That could have fit. I think Elks just fits really nice too, especially the other names. Eagles might have been okay.
Right. Well, Elks is part of their heritage too.
Of course.
They were named the Elks at one time. About 100 years ago. So them coming back to the Elks name is a good fit. And it's been interesting just kind of following along what's, the kind of the media up in Edmonton and everything up there. Even though I am in Chicago, I follow the CFL religiously. Mm-hmm. It's mostly positive. You've got a few haters in there, and of course you've got that other side of it. People were really upset about getting rid of the Eskimos name, which it's understandable. We live in a different age now where, much like, look how long it took for the Redskins to finally ditch the Redskins name. So, but at least Edmonton was a little bit out front on this one. But they had been kicking it around for a while. But, obviously world events being the way they are, took a life of their own, and here we are.
Right. And it's interesting how the name change accelerated, because the Edmonton form at that time, the Eskimos themselves, they had been kind of having more of an accelerated process, because in 2015 they had some push for that name change. 2019, in February of that year, they had finally came back after review, and they had said, we've done our research, we have everything locked down, we're going to stick with the name according to what we've decided. And then roughly a half a year later, and this is again response kind of to the formerly known Washington Redskins, when they finally went to the football team, Edmonton then went and did a quick research recap and kind of did touch their bases, if you will, and went back to the same thing. So this is, like you're saying, it's been kind of kicked around for a little bit, and almost felt like I guess it would be inevitable. I mean, even their team president had also mentioned that this would have possibly been the move no matter what. It's just the timing was going to have to be the case. And just seems like a hit now.
And the key thing is you're just changing a name. You're not changing the football. It's still your hometown team.
Right.
For instance, if the Bears decided to change their name or something, it would still be, you'd still be rooting for Chicago. You're still rooting for that C on the helmet.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Although it's curious you say that, because, the conversation, and you'll understand this, is that right now the Bears have the whole talks of Arlington Heights being moved. And in the past, the city of Chicago has actually said that they would take away the name of Chicago on the Bears if they moved out of Chicago.
Oh, I have fond memories of all the times I have heard the Bears saying they're going to leave Chicago, and it's not going to happen. At least I don't think it's going to happen. Let's say within the next 10 years. But right now, nobody's building anybody a stadium unless it's privately funded. And, up in Arlington Heights, they're going to need public money to get a stadium like that built with the current Bears ownership.
Right. Plenty of land out there if we're talking Chicago. In terms of the Edmonton Elks now, you mentioned that logo for the Bears, the C logo. Well, the Elks, they will retain the double E logo. It's going to be more of a throwback third uniform from what it's being talked about. However, the primary is now horns,
which is very cool.
You have a set of green horns. I love this change. I think it looks so slick on that yellow helmet, how they did this. And of course, they're retaining the double E logo. And so not only do you keep, the synonymous with the tradition, but you also have some merch sales you can get with that old retro look as well.
Yeah.
It fits perfectly for their franchise.
Yeah, and it actually kind of times out perfect with the fact they had no money coming in last year.
Mm-hmm, right.
So now, and I've already, from what I've been told by my friends up in Edmonton, you can't buy merchandise because they sold out immediately. So for the team, it's a huge cash cow. Mm-hmm. It's, rebranding yourself is not a bad thing, bottom line wise.
Right.
Which I don't understand why more teams don't do it, because the fan and all of us, I mean, we have money to spend. And even just to change in uniform or even change in colors, I'm surprised teams don't do it more often because there's so much money to be made. So for Edmonton, considering, and they're one of the more healthier CFL teams in terms of money. However, that they're making money off of this. And, I'm sure the other teams are kind of looking, going, and the only other team I can think of off the top of my head in the CFL who has had more uniform changes, let's say in the last 5 years, has been the BC Lions. But the BC Lions are a whole nother issue. Yeah.
That one's a bit of a mess with ownership, ownerships and finding who's going to take what out there too. Another one I'd fit in there, and at least we're talking good rebrands. The Alouettes had a really nice one just recently. Uniforms are slick. The merch looks really good as well.
The uniform's great, but I'm not big on the helmet. I just did not like how they did that helmet. But that's kind of the traditionalist in me too.
That's fair.
I like the one that they replaced. The one that replaced I like, but I don't know, just the way. But that's Montreal. They've also been known to have their logo at the front. I mean, back in the 70s, they had a triangle with the word Alouettes on it. In front of their helmet. So.
Right. Yeah, I mean that is something you can think about. I'm not saying that every CFL team should retool their logo. By the way, I mean there's some you wonder, like, honestly, if I'm looking at like them at the ones right now, there's a few that are classics in my opinion. Like Calgary and Saskatchewan, I think those are solid. You don't move that. The W
Right.
for Winnipeg, it's another one, like, you
Oh
don't
yeah.
touch that. For me, BC, I actually think would be one. I'm like, well, you could probably touch up the lion logo a little bit. It does look slightly dated, I guess, but wouldn't be against anything. The Argonauts, obviously, they slightly rebranded a bit as well. So,
And over the last 20 years, and really we didn't really have down here in the States CFL football up until the last 15 years.
yeah,
Because I mean ESPN carried a few games, but once ESPN fully bought into the CFL, we were all able to see these different uniform combinations. So every CFL team has done a great job, I think, in selling themselves with, at least on the field, with their brand in terms of changing up the uniforms, throwbacks, different variations. The flip side is it's hard to buy CFL merchandise, especially there. It's not like you go for the NFL, and I always hate comparing the CFL to the NFL, but in this case, why not? Because it's a good comparison. If you really want merchandise, you can go to NFL.com, click one link, boom, you're right at the store. CFL, it's a little bit different. You have to go through a few steps. And the other part is there's a whole market down here in the States that would, there's a lot of us who like the CFL, but we've got to pay that international shipping, and that does cost a lot.
Yes, that does add a bit of a trickery to it. The ownership side of it kind of plays in as well, with, or at least the websites and where you can get the merch as well.
Yeah.
And I have a similar issue where when I'm looking at like other leagues, for example, I'm a major arena football, indoor football guy. So the two major leagues, the IFL and the NAL, they're mostly team based. The IFL's trying to be like the NFL soon, where they're trying to, like, we'll have a centralized shop and all that, but it's hard, if you're not big like the NFL, if you have not gotten the coercion, not coercion, but I would say unity at least of the teams like the NFL does. Say the CFL could use that for a centralized shop better, or a better centralized shop. That does help. But I mean, that's something that's one of the things they can address down the line. Obviously, there's a few things, and they got the XFL thing they're going on right now.
Yeah.
So, a lot of stuff on the plate.
And I think now during the pandemic, and hopefully, again, this is where I always say, I mean, we're all on Twitter. This is really, if you think about it, it's kind of a small community. The CFL Twitter universe is kind of a very small community, which is kind of nice, but it's also kind of disheartening too. But I do know this, that management, I know the CFL commissioner follows me. So I know they're listening. But the question is, are they going to listen and do what they need to do to get the league to where it can be? The whole XFL thing is, that enters into the XFL discussion. Which to me, I don't think the XFL, at least the thought of the XFL coming in and either going to an alliance or merging or whatever, is a bad deal.
Yeah,
is a bad thing. The question is do you keep the Canadian game? Do you go with US rules, or somewhere in between? And I think it's going to be somewhere in between.
Right. The big question, what do you do with the rules? Because that's something that becomes kind of a flashpoint for some people. And, it's like, well, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to touch the game or adjust the game too much, and I mean, I agree with that, of talks I have with people, and like, I get it. That's a game you've grown up with. I cannot deny that would be a problem, but man, if they want to do this route, like you're saying, sacrifices, like we've been talking for now months, it seems like end on end from people, are gonna have to come up, and we doesn't even know when we're gonna be even talking about it further, because
it
sounds like there's a lot of NDAs going on, because Danny Garcia from the XFL side said, I can't really talk right now.
Well, which is kind of nice, because a lot of times you get, I mean, the government leaks like a sieve. I mean, the government's, it's impossible to keep a secret in government, but it's actually kind of nice to see that everybody's kind of keeping their mouth shut on this one. And there are things and that kind of makes me hopeful, but ultimately you're going to, it's like anything. You've got negotiations. Somebody's always going to be unhappy.
Right.
Plain and simple.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to be unhappy, and who knows how it's going to shake out. I've seen proposals out there. In fact, I've got on my at CFLamerica.ca, which honestly I've not really updated at all in the last couple months, but I've got in the hopper, I've got a draft of an article about, well, here's how we could merge the two leagues field wise.
Okay.
And the idea actually came from Argo Fluffy on Twitter. I don't know who he is, but he posted these drawings, and he's done the science and he's done the math. This is where I always say CFL fans are some of the best, because fans, no matter what league, they're always coming up with ideas like uniform concepts. Some of the best uniforms I've seen have been concept uniforms from guys like you and I just sitting at home with extra time on our hands going, hey, I could make this work. So, but there's a way to do field size, because back in the 90s, they really, with the few exceptions, most of the fields in the U.S. couldn't fit a CFL field then. Liberty Bowl, I think down in Shreveport. That's the other problem, too. There aren't too many pictures or images of these fields, of these CFL fields back in the 90s. Baltimore was able to fit one in. San Antonio was able to fit one in. Sacramento was able to fit one in. But the other ones, they were kind of a tight fit. They just weren't really made for the CFL field. Well, you know, you come 25 years later and you kind of look at what we have in terms of soccer fields. Because really, if you're going to play a CFL brand football, you're not going to play it in a big giant stadium, because you're just not going to get the crowds.
Sure.
So kind of like what the XFL did, version 2.0, they put as many games as they could into a soccer stadium. The DC Defenders was, I think, a good example. And I believe now when the XFL second version was going on, I didn't watch any of them, because in those 5 weeks, I think I had about 4 weeks of reserve military duty. So I never got any games.
Okay, then.
I had heard about it. My nephew told me about it. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to get too invested on this one, because I got a feeling I know how this is going to end. Well, sure enough, 5 weeks into it was done.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a way to make it work, I think, now successfully, but it's not going to be NFL success. It's going to be, Arena League football success back in the early 2000s when they were on NBC. I could see that.
And that's not bad exposure, because that was the height of Arena itself was kind of big. Like, it was the new hip thing on the block. So
it was,
at least it was the new, like, now it's in the popular eye hip thing on the block. Cause it was around obviously in the early 90s, but like, it was kind of big then. Like, it was, it had made some moves. And of course, Kurt Warner helped that too, that exposure, but yeah.
But if you remember when they were on NBC, for that short time that was, for me, again, you have to consider too, it's February. There ain't a whole lot going on. Oh, yeah. I'm not a basketball fan. So I'm like, perfect. I got football on Sunday for a few weeks. And, you saw the crowds. I went to, I think, about 3 Chicago Rush games during that period. And there were some decent crowds. So hopefully, again, trying to use that as an example. I think the CFL, XFL, whatever they decide to become or call themselves, could actually have that success. And I think they could sustain and build on it.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what, Greg, something with the soccer stadium concept, with the XFL, and I will say that for reference, I didn't go to one of the games at a soccer stadium. As you might tell with the shirt here, I went to the Dome. I was a Battlehawks fan, so I went and saw it, at a regular NFL stadium, which, and for reference, the Dome Americas, or the Dome in St. Louis, it cannot fit a CFL stadium. That has been proven.
Right.
But the soccer experience, at least on TV, you're talking at least Audi Field, where you're referencing with DC. It's a personalized, like, it's pretty much more intense of a fan experience is what I would almost describe it. You have a lot more guys. It's a lot more in tight with the players. You're closer to the field. I think you get as much as it's less people. I think there's more energy there, because, I think the crowd gets more interactive that way, with less people spread out like that. You relate better to the game, I think, in the moment during the game.
Yeah.
So not to mention you fit the CFL dimensions for most of them. You just have to cut down the end zones a little bit.
Yeah, the end zone
bada
is
bing,
going to
bada
be
boom.
I think the end zone will be a tight fit. I think you can actually get it right up. If you can go 15 yards for an end zone, I think that's a good compromise because
Oh,
I
yeah.
believe Toronto, that's how the end zone is. I think
Mhm.
they're only about 15 yards. And they're not the full CFL length, but they've had now Toronto's a different story because nobody goes to the games in Toronto right now. If you've ever watched a CFL game out of Toronto, all you see are just empty stands.
I've talked with Paul Woods out there, massive Toronto Argonauts historian, and that's something, like you said, it's a challenge right now. Biggest market in Canada, but it's one of the weakest right now for Canadian football.
Yeah, we're going to be talking to Paul, I think Saturday.
Good conversation.
For our show. I spent an hour with him on the phone just getting to know him. And we could have talked for hours upon hours. So there was so much there. So I'm looking forward to talking to him about just the history of the team.
Oh, yeah.
And, because I know how he feels about kind of going forward, but I want to go, at least in our podcast, we look backwards as much as we can because there's just so much rich CFL history there that nobody's talking about. Occasionally, and depending upon which CFL podcast you listen to, good example is the Turf District up in Edmonton. My buddy Mike is the historian on that show, but it's not a history show, kind of like what Scott and I decided we were going to make ours, because we're both older. We both grew up in a time back in the 70s where we look back on it and it's like, those were great times. And so we have all these authors out there who've written these great books, both on the north side of the border and the south side. So we're trying to bring them all in. But to your point, yeah, Paul is great in terms of his, but he's one of those. He's like, yeah, if it's got to change, it's got to change. And
right.
It's, that's the thing with people who are really diehard fans. It's change sucks, but sometimes it's got to happen, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and personal note for myself, and just I guess online presence. I hope things slowly and gradually adjust to where we can be more buddy with each other. I mean, it's gotten better than when the initial announcement went off, but even at times, if a certain phrasing of something on any site, I'm not even going to list the sites because it'd be stupid and I would be called out for it. I'm not going to do that kind of crap. But if a site that covers one of the leagues says a phrase on the other in any certain light, and you have a certain amount of fans just grab it and they start going at each other, then it's just a whole like, whoa, it's not on us, man, or like you're basically trying to back off, or you're trying to like fight at each other. And I really hope as this develops, no matter what happens with these talks, I mean, just gotta be like, let's chill out, guys. Like,
it's the thing. We all got to get along, because it's like like we always used to say in the Navy when we were dealing with our Army brethren, hey, you know what? It's a pain in the ass dealing with each other, but in the end, it's one team, one fight. And so, and that's kind of how I look at it. And it's because being kind of, I don't know. I mean, I feel sometimes, and I know I'm not, but like that lone American down here, sometimes defending the CFL. And I've listened to a lot of the XFL podcasts, and they're all great. I mean, there's, as I was starting to listen to when everything happened, there were a few that were I got very defensive of the CFL. It's like, wait a minute, don't be dismissive of my league. You're still learning it. And there were a few podcasts, and I'm not like you. I'm not going to name anybody out.
It's just not worth it,
But I'm listening to them, and I'm like, oh, you guys are reading from the Wikipedia, aren't you? No, don't. And I'm like, okay, I know you're trying, and I know, and I'm, again, like you, we've all got to get along. So it's been nice to see now all these on the south side of the border, everybody who is diehard XFL starting to come around and reading up on the CFL, learning more of its history. The guys at the Markcast are great. They've had guests. I mean, they really do a great job.
Oh yeah.
XFL News Hub does a great job too. And the other ones, they're doing a much better job to kind of build that camaraderie.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about growing a community, I think, either way.
Yeah.
Definitely give those guys praise that you mentioned off, by the way. I mean, they're doing their work. I cannot deny that. That is definitely something I will say that, when you're talking to everyone and you're trying to get an angle that's in the Canadian perspective, that's a good job, and that's definitely something that needs to be done.
And also too, I mean, it's we're talking about two countries here. And the
Absolutely.
CFL is part of, in many ways, part of that cultural identity. If you look back at the history of it, how the game developed in Canada was different from how it developed down here. So there's also cultural things too. And, let's face it. I mean, we're Americans and Canadians, and there's always been that big brother, little brother type of relationship. And I always tell some of my Canadian friends, don't compare yourselves to us Americans. Cause I mean, I'm like, you don't need to. You guys got a great product up there.
Right.
Yes, the NFL is bigger and we've got a lot more down here, but at the same time, at least in the last 4 years, we've been kind of at each other's throats. And so let's not do it with football. And that's the one thing about football, it brings us all together. It doesn't matter if it's north, south, blue or red, east or west. Well, the only time where I'm okay with divisions in football and hatred is when it comes to the Bears and Packers. But other than that,
what I'm talking about. Got to bring up. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's one. Everyone. I mean, to me, I'm accepting of that. I can dismiss the Packers any given day.
It's always, I always say when the Packers lose, an angel gets its wings.
Oh, it's a beautiful thing. Wish it would happen more often.
Hopefully it does. It's always, I'm like, I'm on all those Facebook anti-Packer, and again, a lot of my good friends are Packer fans, so it's even better. Mm-hmm. It's even better. It's like fantasy football when you beat your boss in fantasy football.
I've got no joke. I have a buddy that lives in Aurora, Illinois, that has been a Detroit Lions fan since I have known him for 6 years. I'm not kidding you. He loves Matthew Stafford that much. Of course, now he's a Rams fan. So
yeah. But it's funny because I'm in a simulation league. We play Action PC football.
Oh, all right.
Check it out because I'm in like 6 leagues. So I jumped into this one league. They're like, we got one opening. I'm like, okay, who you got? The Lions. I'm like, okay, all right, I'll take the Lions. So, but fortunately, I got in right before, months before the trade. So I made sure I got Stafford along with his offensive line. So I think I might have built myself a contender, at least to start off. We'll see how the draft goes. But I digress. But, talking about the Lions over at the Sports History Network, Arnie is a huge Lions fan. And first time I ever talked to Arnie, just, talking about setting up our podcast, I go, I'm sorry. I'm a Lions fan. I'm sorry.
That's all you can say.
But I grew up in the Chicago area, but for a few years I lived in Michigan as a little kid. So there was a possibility at one point I was going to be a Lions fan, just by the fact that my dad got transferred back down here. That I was actually a Dolphins fan first before I was a Bears fan, and then I eventually an Arizona Cardinal fan.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we were talking about it the other day, or actually just today, I think it was, about how the game that got you into at least into the playing, I believe, or was at least the fandom, the fandom. Thanksgiving blowout of the Cardinals.
I was 10 years old and I had the same style glasses as Bob Greasy did. Okay. Now, when you're 10 years old wearing and going to Catholic school and wearing glasses like that, you're just, you're pretty much scarred for life at that point.
Yeah.
Just starting out.
Maybe.
But Bob Greasy had the same glasses, and I'm like, I wanted to be Bob Greasy. Wanted to be him in the worst way. Didn't quite work out that way, but but the first game I really was able to watch, this is back in the 70s when we didn't have ESPN. I mean, we had 3 channels. Well, really 4 up here in Chicago, 4 or 5.
Yeah, that's fair.
But Thanksgiving of '77, the Dolphins and the Cardinals played, and I sat there. I don't remember where we were. I just remember watching the whole game, and Bob Greasy threw 6 touchdown passes, and for him, 6 passes in a game was still a lot.
Right.
and he
Right.
just destroyed the Cardinals. And the one thing I remember from that game is not so much him scoring all those touchdowns, was Conrad Dobler getting so pissed off about the game that he tossed his helmet into the stands. So that's where it started for me. And it's, to me, it's the holy grail of YouTube videos of old games.
And everyone's got a different one, you know.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's probably Chicago 2005, maybe 4. Really, the Lovie Smith era, I would say in general, but not really in particular game. Just, you know, my dad finally getting me into the sport a little bit more, and you know, way it went there. You know,
So you never went to the way that the old stadium was.
I did not go to Soldier Field before they put the spaceship down.
Okay.
And looking back, and this is something, you know, as you get older, I got more curious about maybe the past of just, I've been getting more and more curious about, like, say, older NFL,
Right.
you know, as well. And something with Soldier Field that I didn't realize is that its historical status was taken away when the spaceship was put on. And, you know, looking back, I'm like, and looking at, you know, like, say, the 85 footage or just any time before 2002, I'm just like, oh man, that kind of would have been cool. You know, it kind of reminds me of like how South Bend is with Notre Dame, you know, just like all the tight benches together, you know, everyone's just a madhouse in there. That's what it reminds me of. And of course, the columns just add to that atmosphere.
Right.
So I kind of wish I could have that experience, you know, if I had the chance.
I've been to the old stadium. I've been inside the old stadium, at least off the top of my head, I think 3 times.
Okay.
First time was 85 Springsteen concert.
Oh, all right.
Second time was, I went to a soccer game with my then fiance and my sister. I think Real Madrid was playing, and I forget who Real Madrid was playing.
Real Madrid.
Or Real Madrid, I think that's how you pronounce it.
That's
and then in 2001, this was like October, so this was like several weeks after 9/11. I had tickets to go see the Cardinals. So I took my wife, and my wife was completely disinterested because being Japanese, she's not into football. Okay. But I'm glad I went because that was one of Pat Tillman's last games.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah. So, I mean, that was the last time when I was in the old stadium. So but when they built the new stadium, of course, when I saw the designs, I'm like, that's horrible. That, you know, I don't know why they picked that design, but they picked it. But a few years later, went to see a Cardinals preseason game against the Bears. Saw Brian Greasy play. Saw Kurt Warner. Saw Larry Fitzgerald from high atop the nosebleed seats.
Oh yeah.
And up there, I'm like, this is a pretty good view. And walked around. It's really nice. It's really nice on the inside. And of course, on the inside, you can see the colonnades. You can see they did a lot to preserve the history of it. But on the outside, it's just that whole thing, you know, when I drive, you know, even where I look at it, where I work at downtown, I can see the stadium from the office. And I look at it and I go, it just doesn't look right. But it's a great place to see a game. So it's, you know, and I've been there. Well, I was there one other time for a Browns preseason game.
Okay.
But it's just a big, pro football is so different from when I grew up that.
Well, I can only imagine, you know, and I'm still, like I was just telling you, I think more and more I'm trying to dig back as it is. Cause like, to me, most of credit, I still have some of the history down, and I try and add some, but you know, like, or not to toot my own horn there, but like, just, I've been getting better, but you know, like, I still miss a few things. So like, I'm not perfect. I have to look back and check out.
Yeah, but that's okay because, hey, you're in your mid-20s. So that's, you're learning. I mean, that's a great thing about your podcast. I mean, I know you're learning as you go along. You talk to great guys like Paul Woods. Have you talked to Upton Bell yet?
No, but he that would be on my list. I'm still compiling people. You know, that's the thing. And it's as I talk about the format here, you know, I'm once a week.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll do more. This is something now I'm like, well, there's so many people I want to talk to, and so many weeks in the year, and then you know, you got topics every now and then that go from there and like that. So, you know,
I talked to Upton last week.
Okay.
Because we're gonna have him on our show.
Right.
And I expected a 5-minute phone call. We talked for at least an hour. Some great stories. Sure. I'm like, And again, it's like the one time I talked to Roland Harper, and I had to talk to him for my job, and I'm just like, I'm back to being 10 years old. I'm like, like sign my, you just want to, hey, can you sign your autograph? It's just that, that 12-year-old came out of me. And talking with Upton, I got his book on my shelf.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just, he was good friends with Don Shula. He was the GM of the page. And I'm like, I am talking to living history here. And so, right. And that's the beautiful thing about football, and especially being a football fan, and kind of what we do with podcasts in this day and age. We're able to talk to the people that whose work we really truly appreciate. Jack Gilden is another one. If you've read the book Unitas and the book on Unitas and Shula, Jack's it's a really good book. Amongst all, and there's a lot of, I could show you, I've got a whole football thing back here with the bookshelf and everything. But amongst all my football books, his is one of the best, because it combines the history, and it actually kind of combines the history of the time that I was born into. So it helped me understand it better. But it's a great story about him and about Unitas and Shula.
Mm-hmm.
And Johnny U is a fascinating character study. In fact, I did a whole Johnny U book, went through like several of his biographies. And then I was talking to Upton about, here's talking to Upton Bell, who was knew Johnny U. And it was just one of those moments I hung up the phone. I'm like, wow, this is kind of cool.
Right. And you get a bit more on Mr. Football himself,
Yeah.
That's got to be unique and different perspective,
right.
Something you might not have thought before or heard about before.
Right. Well, and the thing is, like, I'm going to be 54. And when I talk football, like you and I are talking, I forget that I'm 54.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I've been playing simulation football, which is a big thing I've got into ever since I retired from the Navy, because I had extra time now.
Yeah.
And it went from, hey, do you want to be in one league, to, I'm in 6. Oh, can you do a 7th? I go, yeah, I can do a 7th. And in fact, we got a draft going on now. I got, because I took over a team that was kind of on the downhill slide.
Oh, you did?
And then I looked at the draft. I'm like, oh my God, the previous owner traded all my good draft picks away. But I'm in another league where the team was on the upswing, that unfortunately the owner had to give up the team. And he basically gifted me the 1972 Pittsburgh Steelers through simulation football it's different than fantasy, because you're playing with guys from different eras, and it's all based on stats and everything. Mm-hmm. And I got interested in it by, there was a book out there called Pastime by Ted Gluck, who I think he was a former player himself. But he was in one, he wrote a book, got into one of these leagues and wrote a great book about it. Well, I got into my first league and talking to a couple of the guys, and one of the guys, Randy, we're talking. He's like, yeah, I'm in that book. Really? He goes, at the very end, check it out. There's like a whole chapter of my buddy Randy. I'm like, this is cool. This is cool. Now, with that said, that first league that I joined, you know what my record is? We're midway through the second season. I'm 0-18.
I was going to say, the way you're making the tone, I'm like, this is not going to go well.
No, it's been a hard season in the with my 67 Dolphins. I was given the 66 Dolphins, so I knew I had a crap team going in.
Okay.
And it you know what? You think they were bad in real life? If you look at the stats and you watch the old footage, they were even worse on the computer.
Oh gosh.
And then I ended up like kind of giving away everybody for draft picks. We'll see how that works out. But I still have yet to win a game. And at 0-13-1, I got greasy. So, and then I traded away draft picks for about half the Chiefs defense. So we'll see.
This sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it hasn't worked out well for me.
This whole thing sounds fascinating. I'm a fantasy football guy. I generally have at least 3 leagues a year myself. So like, and I love doing it. We're in just the modern day. We're like looking into beyond just the star players or who's better on the stat sheet, than say, just on name recognition. So that sounds incredible. And honestly, I've heard of stuff like this. I have never played a simulation like that before.
It's
you're buying me into it more and more.
It's I always joke. I go, it's my wife. She never questions where I'm at because I can play this game on the couch. It's not like I'm in front of the big computer. I can play it on the laptop.
Oh, that's great.
And yeah, it's actually kind of nice, especially the software that we use. It's real simple software, and it doesn't. I mean, you can run it on an old computer, which makes it even better because all I have are old computers. So it really, I can play it anywhere. But it's games like it's just stuff like that. It just keeps you young. That's a great thing about football.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps you young. And going back to what you said about fantasy football, I'm at least I think 2 leagues going in. We'll see. Now 3. Again, this is where I'm like, wait a minute, I think I got another league going
Sure.
in. Hey, do you want to be another? Yeah, sure. Because now it's so easy with the app and everything.
Right.
But there's a great book I read by Matthew Berry.
Okay.
On fantasy football. It's called Fantasy Life. I just finished it up last night, and it's a great read. And it's for anybody who's played fantasy football or fantasy baseball will love this book. I saw it at the library a few weeks ago. I go, yeah, this looks pretty good. So I'm reading it. I go, yeah, I know who they're talking about because he talks about different archetypes in a fantasy football league. Like there's always that one guy who's a dick about everything.
Fair point.
And then
fair point.
Yeah, and then there's stories about guys, doing their fantasy football drafts while their wife's giving birth, and just some great stories.
The dedication and how much it's exploded even more so, I would say, in the last 10 years, just adds on to what you'll hear more and more about. And honestly, you're going to have to give me a list of these novels here because there's a few of them. I'm like, okay, I need to look some of these up, and I need to start getting more in this. There's a few USFL novelists that I need to find myself. Like I've heard about those stories as well.
Football for a Buck by Jeff Roman.
That's the novel I want right there. I've been wanting to get that one. I've heard so much. I believe that is the one, the author himself, and I'm sorry I'm spacing on the name. I believe he was on the Rich Eisen show trying to talk some of the stories as well. And I'm going
he was telling the story about how when they lost a lawsuit and Trump was sitting next to Wellington Mara reached into his pocket and gave Trump $1.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That clip, I love that clip on
and that's a great thing about YouTube. And I always, I'm a student of history, and so when I explained to my teenage nieces and nephews about how good things are now, I go, yeah, I understand. We can do anything. If you want to be a radio show, you got a podcast. Right. You want to be what we're doing now. I mean, we're on. We're going to be on TV. This is going to be on the internet till well after we die.
True. So that is a weird thought, but it's not the first time that I've thought about that, honestly, just out of the blue.
Right.
But yeah, it's an amazing thing. I mean, hey, just random thing myself that I'm surprised I found this, but thank you for the internet. And this is USF related. The Houston Gamblers had a theme song in the 80s called Run and Shoot. It was like a arena band from Houston that made the song for the team.
Really? I didn't know
someone randomly posted. It's called Run and Shoot. Look it up after we're done. But it's catchy as hell, but goofy and cheesy, like you'd expect, like an 80s, like one of those 80s like team songs, like the Bears, like
kind of like the Super Bowl Shuffle.
Not like the Super Bowl Shuffle exactly, but kind of along the line where you're like, okay, this does have that like it was the time type of thing, but I don't know. It's kind of catchy. I play it every now and then.
I got to check it out. Well, I mean, talking about Houston and football, I'm a big fan of the Houston Oilers in the Love You Blue era.
Oh man. I there are times, and even more so looking up the Oilers themselves, I know why the logo's retired. I wish it wasn't retired. And I hope
it's one of the best logos. It's a great thing about eBay is so one day on eBay, I go, you know what? I need an Oilers mini helmet and a pennant.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, you know what? If I buy another jersey, my wife's going to kill me. But they've got solid Houston Oiler blue sweatshirts on Amazon for like $6.
Yeah, that's right. My second favorite running back all time is Earl Campbell. Right. Yeah. Before Walter Payton always will be my pinnacle. But Earl Campbell will always be that second one just for how tenacious he is as a runner. And, the Oilers logo, it's synonymous. You have one without the other. Or Warren Moon, same type of deal. Yeah. And CFL and NFL legend in the same right. That way too.
Yeah. And the great thing about like that era in the 70s, the 70s was a great era football wise, especially if you're a kid growing up, because you had you had a few things going for you back then. You had the NFL Today on CBS, which, man, you heard that music. Boy, I was right there in front of it. And you had Howard Cosell.
Yes. Yes.
And it was the 70s were a perfect era. At least I think, again, I'm looking at it through rose colored glasses looking back, but I get so nostalgic for that era. Just even on YouTube, going, just watching an old Monday night game and just hearing and getting that vibe. There's something about it. Now, with that said, back then, I mean, you didn't, I think I appreciate it. I must have really appreciated it then, because I don't think if I wouldn't have appreciated it then, I don't think I'd appreciate it now. But we don't. But it was just such a great era. And then back then, like now, everybody when they think Terry Bradshaw, they think the old the old guy on TV.
Sure.
But back in the 70s, man, I don't know why he doesn't get the credit for being such a great quarterback. He never gets his due.
I would say definitely one to put the work in is what I kind of get, black and blue era type of quarterback,
Right.
fits in. But yeah, I mean, he usually seems like, you talk greats among greats, people reference him. He's, Hall of Fame, but, beyond that, you recognize Hall of Famer. Like, it's almost weird sometimes talking about Hall of Famers where it's like, there's like Hall of Fame, like standard, like it's weird. It's like Hall of Fame standard. Then you get like elite Hall of Famers too. Now we're at that point.
Right.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but
well,
maybe to tie that in.
It's different to compare eras too. That's the one thing. And Upton Bell and I were having this conversation, and we were talking. And I asked him. He goes, you can't compare eras, which I've always known. Which is going back to that whole simulation football thing. I've learned in playing that there players from a certain era cannot play in other eras, just because of the way a lot of things different. Baseball is so different because you can actually plug players in from different eras and actually get a good comparison just based on stats. But one quarterback who was a great quarterback was Archie Manning. But you look at the team he played on, I mean, he never. But had you put him on the Steelers team or put him on the Raiders or given him a decent line somewhere, say in Miami, who knows?
If he wasn't beaten up 24/7, it seems like New Orleans,
Right. And yeah. So, and it's, just thinking about that. So I'm kind of riffing here in terms of just things off the top of my head.
Oh, you're good.
So there's a great short story by George R.R. Martin. Stop me if you've heard this, but it's called The Last Super Bowl. And it gives you, I will send you the link once we finish up here.
Well, yeah, you'll send me the list of everything.
I will send you the list. And so anyway, it's a short story written by George R.R. Martin way back in the 70s. In fact, where it first appeared at was a men's magazine. Okay. Which, I got the magazine. It's a great magazine to look at without the articles. But this story he wrote predicted the rise of, say, John Madden football.
No kidding.
It really did, because again, without giving too much away in the story, but as I'm reading it, and again, reading it in the 21st century is different from reading it when it first came out. Because it's kind of nice to read science fiction now that try to predict the future we live in now.
Yeah.
And I tell you what, this one kind of came close. And but the one thing that was in that story that, just talking about players at different eras, every era had great players, but the sad thing is, it's just when we get into, people say, well, like Terry Bradshaw, great, it's like he's only, but back, no, he was good for his time. Could he have? I think he actually he could have been one of the best, say, had he played in this era. But you get a guy like Tom Brady, even Peyton Manning, they couldn't take the abuse that Johnny Unitas took.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder, and obviously rule changes and things like that, protections for QBs, the evolution of the game that plays into some play styles getting more popularized, or at least having more of the ability to grow, if you will.
Right. Well, when they opened up the passing game in the 70s, the Mel Blount role, that changed everything. But it made for better football. And that's the thing. Every rule change has made the game better and safer, but it's still a violent sport when you really think about it. I mean, I know you played football as a kid. I played football in high school. Yeah, and in fact, the other day I was watching Concussion. I finally got sat down to watch the Will Smith movie, and
I need to see that too.
yeah, it's that's a very sobering movie.
Mm-hmm. You know, something that stuck out with that film that I didn't, looking back, I'm like, yeah, that was kind of like, yeah, I don't know what I was thinking then, or like what we were thinking then. Now that we know what we know about,
Right.
CTE and things, in the film, you might remember there's a clip of Jacked Up, like the old Monday Night Football segment where they're like,
Yeah.
this is the biggest hits of the week. And looking back, like watching that film, and then like thinking after, I'm like, oh yeah, we used to like celebrate like some dude like basically going lights out
Oh yeah.
every Monday night,
Yeah.
before the games. And I'm like, oh yeah, definitely did not age well.
And they don't show those anymore.
Yeah.
At all. I mean, it's much like everything that's gone on in the last 20 years, just, for all of us kind of growing up in the States, just things have really kind of changed rapidly, at least in terms of sports and especially in football in the last 20 years. We know a lot more, but there's so many ways to make the game safer, even just with tackling techniques. But ultimately, it boils down to this. I mean, football is a big money maker. It is a dangerous sport. And, a lot of kids not as many kids are playing football as they used to. And I think, time will tell to see if they're able to make the sport safer, that you're going to see,
right,
more kids come in. I mean, I know when I was growing up, we never talked about concussions. I remember in high school, I mean, looking back on it, I'm sure I got my bell. I know I got my bell rung. Now, obviously not, Mike Webster type getting your bell rung, but, I think all of it, I mean, that's just the nature of the game. So
yeah,
it's a great sport, but one of the great lines in that movie, and I don't remember, but his wife was saying, it's such a beautiful sport, but yet it's so violent. Or I think maybe he said it, which
I believe
gets,
so.
Yeah, which gets to another reason why I love football so much is you can blame NFL films.
Right. Well, football to me is, now we're talking how many leagues, many of us, or at least you and I in the communities we follow, for the most part, it kind of is a universal language. Like all the fundamentals are there. It's just, what version do you like? Or do you like all the versions? Do you like a few handfuls? Like even I can talk like, indoor arena is different, but it's the same. It has all similar concepts, just some tweaks, bells and whistles are different,
6-man football is awesome, which is what arena football is.
Yeah.
Just on a smaller field. Any football to me, I don't care what brand it is, it's football, whether it's 12. And this is where I don't get into arguments with anybody down here about Canadian football, but there's always that conversation. And a buddy of mine I talked to yesterday, I hadn't talked to him in a while, but I remember at a bar down in Arizona, we were just having beer, and it was like midsummer in Phoenix, which, it's 120 out. So of course you got to go someplace cool and get a drink.
Of course.
And I go, well, I don't know about tomorrow. There's a Canadian football game on. And my buddy's like, I'm not going to watch Canadians play football. I'm like, dude, it's Americans who play the sport in Canada. And so I'm like, the CFL is an American league. It just, it's based in Canada, but it's mostly Americans. But with that said, I'd like to see more Canadians play the game. It's just the whole thing of talking about the ratio and that. I would have loved to have seen last year when they canceled the season. Why don't you just have the Canadians, fill out the rosters and everybody's get a 1-year tryout?
Yeah. Ratio is a hot topic. That's another one that's, debating on what do you do with that with, a potential merger scenario if you're going on that line. But it's another thing that, a lot of, at least I've noticed a lot of the Canadian like CFL diehards, they hold that one really tight, and
they do.
That's definitely
for good reason, because that is, I mean, it's part of their heritage.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's part of their heritage. And back in the 90s, when they had the teams down here in the States, we didn't have a ratio down here because that would have violated every labor law there was. So so they've got to figure that one out. I think they will. But if you want to grow the sport, you got to include everybody. It just can't be Americans playing the sport.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Or is what I've heard too, you can't make it just an American minor league.
Right.
Canada just has much importance in the it is the importance of CFL. It's a national,
right.
It is a national pastime heritage
right.
type of sport for them.
Well, to use the Japanese example, which I love giving, because my wife is Japanese and I've spent a lot of time over there. In Japan, there's only so many slots for foreigners, be they American or Canadian or whatever. There's only so many slots. And I used to think, well, it's kind of discriminatory, and which it is. But with that said, being older and now seeing things in football, I'm okay with that. That's fine. I want to see Japanese players play. When I'm in Japan, I want to see Japanese pitchers. Sure. I don't want to see a guy that was on the Cubs that was washed up with the Cubs. That's not why I want to see. I want to see the homegrown talent, much like their X League over there. You've got the the X League over there. It's basically it's a league that is very much akin to when 1920, when the Bears were the Decatur Staleys. They're all company teams.
Right.
Or at least most of them are. I don't think all of them are.
A good chunk of them are, from a conversation I have had before, which still fascinates me. But, that is a good point. The early days of, the NFL in general, and even, you talk like the CFL as well, like companies, university teams that form into their own clubs. Like, that's how a lot of this stuff started. It's just simple like that. It's just that's continued on the X League, and it's not bad. Get your brand out and you go into the community that way with the team.
Yeah, and when their championship game, they get a lot of people at their championship game in the Tokyo Dome. At least I think I saw at least 30,000.
Yeah. I mean, it's third oldest league too. It's got support.
Yeah.
It is definitely supported, at least in their country and abroad.
And that's the great thing about YouTube. We can actually see those games now. I get alerts every now and then for X League's game coming out. Sometimes the games aren't really that well attended, but then a few times I've watched, I go, well, it's about the same attendance as a CFL game in Toronto. So that's something.
I mean, hey, you're getting some people out there, and you're doing something right if you've lasted this long,
Right.
I mean, it's no slouch how long they've been doing this too.
Yeah. Well, going with the CFL and with the merger and everything, I think the CFL is going to survive everything kind of what we went through, but their business plan has to change because
it does.
Who was I having this? I was on the Markcast having this conversation, and I mentioned to Paul and Rita Grimm. It's like, you need a video game.
Yeah, I am still surprised. Funny enough, I had this conversation a previous episode. I'll tease here, and unfortunately, the studio doesn't exist anymore. But the folks over
playing over at Canuck Games,
Canuck Games. It's a shame what happened there as well. But Dave Winter, I talked to him. I asked him, I was like, well, have you approached the CFL before? And this is something that I think the CFL still is growing through. Is they, Paul's mentioned this too. It seems like it's a lot of times it's catching up to the trends that they seem to not grab. Lately it's been, well, hey, where's the streaming service that the NFL has? Like, why isn't this available? Now, credit, money sometimes gets in the way,
right?
But like for a video game, it's like, okay, you have developers. Like, for example, Canuck Play. They said they approached the CFL. Dave mentioned to me directly, reason why they didn't take it, they wanted an arcade game. They didn't want a simulation, which to me blew my mind. I was like, how are you not looking at this and doing that? And
you're almost like,
that's an example right there. They had a person approach them. Credit,
right?
Dave was a smaller studio, but why not go in?
But it's like, wait a minute, you want what? You do realize that everybody's playing on either a PlayStation or an Xbox. That's how people play their games now.
Yes,
and it's just I get frustrated, and I'm sitting here in my house in Chicago. And I'm like, wait, really? I mean, I don't have kids, but I remember what it's like to be a kid. And I'm like, and I've and my hat's off to those guys who made that game, because I've got, I think, 3 versions for my PlayStation 4.
Oh, good. All right.
So I mean, I put my money. I tried to help them out, But unfortunately, when it came to the gameplay, I mean, you look at the graphics they had. They were great graphics for a Nintendo 64 or an early GameCube.
I did get a chance. I actually do have a copy of Maximum Football 2020, and I did buy 2019 digitally. And it's a shame how the studio closed, because it sounds like there were some circumstances that they're just out of their control.
Right.
Add in COVID, and the budget unfortunately just became tight. Plus next gen hardware, for them. But like, it was fascinating talking with Dave just about the CFL's interaction, because even the XFL, like they were, as many of us know now, they were in developments to be making the XFL's video game at one point, or they were in the early stages when I was talking to him. And it's just amazing seeing the CFL then. And, we're talking about missing the youth movement, or now we're talking about this missing generation of fans, and how a video game would have helped them here.
Yeah.
And that's another growing pain. That's things they're dealing with. And hopefully there's more stuff they're recognizing. Like, for example, I think it's Bill C-218 that's coming. That's going to be the analysis of sports betting.
The gambling one?
Yes, the gambling one. Single game sports betting that should hopefully open some revenue up.
I don't know. I'm really skeptical on that one, because it's like, I posted on Twitter. I don't know if you saw it or not. I go, nobody's explained the math to me.
Fair.
I mean, you know what? I took a creative accounting course in college. Right now, even with that, those lessons learned, you're still not making. I mean, it'd be gambling, especially you're talking fantasy football, like DraftKings and FanDuel.
Yes.
Now the NFL, I know MLB has a share at least in one of them, because I was reading that. I was telling you about reading that book about fantasy sports. There's money to be made in the fantasy sports world. I mean, there's money to be made from gamblers. But the question is, it's a revenue stream, but how is it helping get more? Yeah, you're going to get more gamblers in, but are you going to get that younger generation? Because 16-year-old kids ain't gambling, or at least they shouldn't be.
Man. Well, hey, I mean, if we're talking video game discussion with loot boxes, that's a whole nother thing outside of even football. Gambling.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's the bill is great. Getting gambling in, but really, I mean, you got to look, and they've got to look at a long term. Much like going back to my military days when I was an intel officer. Talking about the Chinese versus the American way of thinking. Chinese look long-term, and adversarial, they look long-term, 60 years down the road, whereas unfortunately Americans, we only look, past the next election. So the CFL has to take that long-term view if they're going to survive, if they're going to grow. So with the XFL kind of coming in, I'm hoping that that's sparking a discussion as to how they survive in the long term. Because COVID exposed. I mean, I've always known that there was time years ago. I'd always every week, every weekend, I would go to CFL database and check the stats on attendance.
Right.
And you would just see that graph going down and up, but you get that graph, and bottom line is it ain't looking good. They are losing fans.
When you're doing gate revenue as your main source, and that's what you analyze, that's fair,
Right.
And broadcast deal wouldn't be anything to think about for another few years, even at the least.
Right. And their broadcast deal, $50 million sounds like a lot, but then you divide it 9 ways, and then you kind of look at it, and $50 million. And you got guys that play on, in the NFL make 50 million, and they're underpaid. And some guys are considered underpaid. I mean, that's $50 million will buy you one quarterback in the NFL.
Yeah, it's not much in NFL dollars. I mean, and it's funny, like you're talking revenue sharing for the broadcast deal. That's a whole nother conversation going on right now too, is should the teams go to revenue sharing? Because that's something that's not common, or used to be common in the CFL. They went away from it. Understandably so, different ownership groups and structures as well. We were talking about Edmonton, they're community-based, which from what we've heard, they are one of the best off in terms of what is in the coffers for surviving this. So, every team's different in its own right. And of course, revenue sharing changes that. That's a big conversation.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because there was a time when the community-owned teams were the ones in the worst financial shape. And everything's now flipped over.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Montreal, I mean, BC, I mean, you look at BC and Toronto and Montreal. Of those three, Montreal's in the best shape. And that's not saying a whole lot. I mean, Toronto has MLSC, but and they are and Toronto, at least they're putting money into signing people, but they're a big billion-dollar corporation,
right,
with other interests. So it's the little things that what you don't see. And I remember seeing on Twitter there was a thing for TSN about their coverage, and they showed the Raptors,
I remember this
the
graphic.
Maple Leafs, Toronto FC, and then Tom Brady.
Tom Brady, you know.
And it's like and many times, you know, instead of trying to listen to hear what people say, it's what you got to hear what they're not saying. And that was a clear case of them not saying anything, and they didn't correct it till later. But yeah, I mean, at least in Toronto to me feels, at least the Argonauts right now feel like what the Sox do in this town.
So if I'm now, from what I know, at least my take on the White Sox, I'm a Cubs fan first off, but
Me too.
For the Sox,
yeah.
I always have known it as kind of maybe rubber banding in terms of support. You know, when it's good, it's good. Like it's real good. When it's low, it's real low. You know, it's not like the Cubbies where there's a flat floor, if you will, of support, no matter if it's lovable losers or you know, going to the NL, at least the NL conference champion or the NLCS, I should be saying. Sorry, I almost botched that. I do know baseball, Ben.
Well, you know, the Sox are, even when the Sox are in contention, they still they can never fill that stadium.
Yeah,
and I know we're comparing apples to kind of oranges with baseball and football, but there are some comparisons. I mean, the White Sox, I mean, their stadium's really not in a good location in terms of where it's at. You know, it's on the highway, but it's on the south side of Chicago, and just with traffic alone, and it's easier to get to than Wrigley Field. I know that much.
That's true.
It's easier to get to, but but Wrigley, it's just, with the Sox, they do put a good product. They got a pretty decent team this year, but
absolutely.
But when they have been competitive, I mean, really competitive, they've still had a hard time filling that stadium up. And they've, you know, people in Chicago, it's like, well, you know, why is that? Well, you know, part of it is the media does kind of short shrift with the White Sox if you just listen to it. In fact, one of the players kind of even said that the other day in terms of just how it is. Sox have always been the second team in town, even when they're winning. And that's just, you know, you look at when they won in 06, was it 06 or 05 now?
It was 05.
Was it 05?
My uncle will tell me first off, we have a split house when it comes to Cubs and Sox fans.
Yeah.
So I know it's 05.
Well, I mean, yeah, just for me personally, they won in 4 games against the Astros. So it was really not even a competitive series. So there was no compelling. I remember the Sox. I mean, again, it even goes to show you, couldn't even remember which year they won. But when the Cubs won, dude, it was like, I watched every pitch of every game for that World Series.
Yeah.
Because there was that moment, and maybe you had it too, but I know people older than me are like, I can't believe I'm watching this. Them in a World Series, because never thought it would happen.
Right.
Ever.
I was just hoping hoping my grandfather would see it. Luckily he did, you know. Then that's crazy in itself, you know.
And it's weird because, you know, growing up, I mean, I've gone away from baseball. I don't follow the Cubs religiously, but man, when the Cubs got in the World Series, I became 12 again. I became that little kid, or 10 to 12-year-old, watching the Cubs on WGN, listening to Jack Brickhouse, following every pitch. And even when they were about ready to clinch the they were about in the NLCS against the Dodgers, and I was in Arizona. My commanding officer of my unit was down there for the weekend, and my CO comes up to me. He goes, "Hey, Smitty, you're coming out to the escape room with us?" I go, "No, sir." "Well, why not?" "Game 6. I don't think I'm going anywhere. So buddies of mine, a few buddies we watched at Faith Brewery and down in Scottsdale, watched them clinch, and that was, I'm like, let's watch. Okay, if this is the best it is, I can die happy. But when the Cubs got to that World Series, man, it was every pitch. And when they were down at Wrigley Field, when they were losing at Wrigley Field, I'm 10 miles, by the way the crow flies, from Wrigley Field. You could feel the tension. I mean, you could just feel everybody in the city was on the edge of their feet. So when they won, that was a surreal moment. It's like, and then I go downtown to work the next day, and it was surreal in the sense that there was very few people on the street, because you knew everybody was up late last night that said, I'm not going to work the next day. And then I went to the train station and I picked up the paper, and there is the headline.
Yeah.
Cubs win the World Series. And it was just that moment. So that's a beautiful thing about sports. And, it's very rare you have a moment. I mean, I can still vividly remember that moment, but I watched the entire World Series here by myself. I mean, I wish I would have had somebody to watch it with, but it was I even get emotional now looking at the replays, or even, hearing the old, Eddie Vedder's song.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that one still gets me because I just remember, that, and that's a great, that moment in time, when they won it all, and I get emotional about it when I think about it.
I definitely remember my time too. I was in college still, Ball State University. The bar I was watching it at actually is closed now. It's not even in existence, but Scotty's Brew House was the name.
Yeah.
Watching Game 7 with my buddies. And no joke, had a W. I still have it today, but I have a W flag I had tied around my neck as a cape, kind of like almost like a good luck charm, if you will. And the rest of my night was just great. I just ran out of the bar, just screaming my mind off, waving this flag in front of this restaurant like a madman. You don't forget that.
No, you don't. And it was surreal. I wish my old man would have been around to see that. But it just, in that moment, I'm like, what is that, 49 at the time? And I'm like, man, all of a sudden I was 10 again. And it was great. It was great. And
feeling. So
then in April, my wife and I, for $25, you can go get a tour of Wrigley Field.
Mm-hmm.
It was a perfect April, almost felt like a fall day. And so we're doing the whole tour. And as part of the tour, they took you to the visitors' locker room.
Oh, wow.
Which has not changed in 75 years. It's the same locker room they'd used.
No kidding.
There was that there's that. My wife's like, you okay? And I'm like, I can hear ghosts. She's like, what are you talking about? Lombardi, Babe Ruth, everybody who was somebody in sports had been in that room.
That's right. Wrigley Field used to be such a mecca for even more than just baseball. I mean, it was the Cubs' home field for decades.
Yeah, but you think of all the football history there.
Bears. I said Cubs.
Yeah.
That was, what I say, the Bears. Yeah.
But all the football, I mean, just the football history. Johnny Unitas was there. I mean, just like, and, unfortunately my wife, I think she kind of got it, but, I mean, you would have been the same way. You're like, oh, wow, I can hear him too.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing about when I'm talking CFL football with people, and like, you're from Chicago? And I go, yeah, Chicago is a great football town.
Yes.
And I still say this is the place they should have the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Because here's why. Here's my theory. Yes, I know they had the hotel, they had the meeting in Canton.
Right.
But if you look at the history of pro ball in this country, Chicago's always been in the center of it.
That's true.
Because the first NFL and the two oldest NFL teams, actually the oldest NFL team, called Chicago home. And you look, Wrigley Field's still standing, and that's the oldest stadium that hosted NFL games that's still standing.
Correct.
Yeah,
that's correct. I mean, hey, I wouldn't mind it, but I get why Canton. I mean, that's where that's where all the official papers and such were all signed up.
Have you been to Canton?
I have been one time. I went to it was actually and I'm forgetting what year it was. That was the AFL 50th year anniversary that I went to. and that was the Bills and Titans dressed as the Oilers
Oh,
for that
wow.
contest for the Hall of Fame game. That was a
Wow.
blast, and
That's awesome.
getting to see Ken, which I need to make another visit at some point. It's on my list again. I have to go back out there and see some of the updated stuff, especially with Brian Urlacher being the Hall of Fame, which that was my kid idol for the
Right.
Bears at the time. I got to see the bust of him in there now.
Yeah.
But the Hall of Fame game, that's a good memory of mine.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Really good one.
I was there and I forget what year it was now, but it was the year. Do you remember when they canceled the Hall of Fame game that day of because the turf was all crapped up?
Yes.
So it was a few weeks before that. I took my nephew. He had just, 13. So I'm like, yeah, he's going to go with his, he was having a place, going with his uncle, Hank. It was big a football geek, both mutual football geeks. So we had a really good time and just went through, but there was that moment, and this is where we're talking about generational stuff. Okay. And he's like, hey, let's get going. I go, dude, give me a minute, man. I'm looking at Joe Namath's jersey and all this stuff.
Right.
Okay. And I look, and my nephew goes, who's Joe Namath? I'm like, oh, wow. But he knew who the modern guys were.
Sure.
He knew, Odell Beckham. I mean, I'm like, okay, well, you and I need to have a long talk. So we were going, if there was, I don't know if it was there when you were there, but there's this kind of collage with a bunch of Hall of Famers, and they're all like from different eras. And I'm like, okay, do you know who that is? It's Joe Montana. Who's 34? Walter Payton. Okay, good. But the Hall of Fame is definitely, I got to go back one of these days.
It's definitely a return trip I'm needing for sure.
Yeah.
Hands down. I love that generational type of thing, but it's pass things down, the history of the game is great. And, especially for Ken,
if you ever, and that's kind of like when we started up our podcast, I'm like, where do we go? Because I want to talk history. I'm like,
right. And
Sports History Network.
Let's discuss your podcast on the network.
Sure.
I know you've been teasing it as we've talked. I'd love to get into this. I've done some digging ever since we started chatting. I'm like, I've seen a few of these guys, interact with a few of these guys on here, and I love the concept of it just being like, hey, there's a lot of stuff to talk about in the past and maybe you've forgotten about, or, you're like, oh, wow, that's kind of a cool recollection piece for any sports, especially when we're talking, in particular, the Sports History Network.
Right.
As a whole that you're on. So,
right.
Give us a little bit of taste of that.
So, the guy who founded it is a guy by the name of Arnie Chapman, and he's the football history dude. So if you're looking on a podcast, football history dude, he's FH. I think he's FH dude on Twitter.
Okay.
And then you got the Sports History at Sports History HQ, which is a Twitter handle for the network itself. So I first started listening to Arnie several years ago, and there was a moment there where I was kind of looking at the website and I saw a guy by the name of Joe Zimba. I don't know if Joe Zimba wrote the history book on the Chicago Cardinals. Okay. Joe's a friend of mine. He's from Chicago. I've been to a couple of his lectures. Well, Joe got on the podcast network, and then one by one, all my fellow, Oz Davis and Joe Pritchard, who do the the Rouge, White, and Blue podcast for the CFL. Well, okay. Oz has a show on the Sports History Network, Truly the Goats, Truly great, and he's also got one on just the history of sports. He just did one on Gaelic. Was it not Gaelic football? What's the Irish? It's Irish hockey. It's basically field hockey.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. He just did a show on that. I'm sorry, it's like it's been a long day, so. Yeah, but he did but then you've got Darren Hayes, he's a Pigskin Dispatch. He does a daily show every day. A little bit of sports history comes out, but there's like a whole bunch of different podcasts, and they're all under Arnie's umbrella. And Arnie has really worked hard to put this all together. I got to give him his due. I'm like, I don't know, it's. I'm older. I don't know if I would have the energy that he does, but he's brought everybody together, and there's so many podcasts. It's hard to listen to every one of them.
True.
And so when Scott and I became friends over Twitter. That's just kind of how things seem to have happened in the last few years. But Scott wrote a book about pro football in Birmingham.
Okay. Quite a good subject, by the way, if all things considered. That's a wonderful book if you think about all the leagues that have been through it.
Oh, yeah.
And I've actually told people, too, I'm like, Birmingham, Alabama is kind of a mecca for all spring football history. Like, it's seen it all. You know, all the stories have gone through there at some point, it seems.
And, so, we just got talking on Twitter. So I'm like, dude, let's do a podcast. And so that's kind of how it started. So we did our first one where I interviewed him in April.
Okay.
And then we did one this past month talking to Roy Rosmos, who he's working on his 5th book on the history of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And his books, and I'm not, I love plugging people's books and just trying to get try to up everybody's sales. We don't make a dime off of it. It's just nice to see people succeed.
Oh, sure.
But Roy's books, he sent me these books. It was last summer. And when I got them, I'm like, oh my, these. And I told him on the podcast, beautiful books. I mean, they're quality picture books that you would put on a coffee table.
Oh, wow.
And he did it just for the love of doing it. He goes, I don't make any money off of this, but I did it for the love of it. And it's, it's kind of cool. I mean, these books will, be sitting in a library or be in people's collections for years and years. So, and we're going to have Paul Woods on here, talking to him this weekend, Upton Bell, and Ron Snyder, who wrote the book on the Baltimore Stallions.
Yes.
We're planning on having him. Jack Gilden, who wrote the book on Unitas and Shula. So that's kind of where we're at right now. It's with work-wise, especially with me. I'm also, attending school part-time, going back to school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so using the GI Bill. Yeah, I'm trying to use what I have left of my GI Bill just a little bit more. It's actually kind of interesting going back to school because, again, in my 50s and everything's online now. So it's been different. Yeah. But like for the summer, I'm taking a Western Civ class. Like, why? History was always my best subject. Never had a history course in college. It was a poli-sci minor, which was kind of like history, but this is kind of nice. Just so after you and I get off, I'll probably be hitting another chapter tonight, studying.
The historical side of things, and you're talking about taking a Western historical class, historical or civilization class. That just seems like it fits right into your forte.
And I'm also going to be taking a film course too later this summer too, which kind of fits in the whole thing. Like I said before, I love NFL films. Without NFL films, I don't think I'd be as big of a football fan as I am today. If Chris Willis is another author who's written a lot of history books on the NFL, but he's a head researcher at NFL Films. I told him that one day. I was going back and forth with him on emails, and I go, dude, without you and Steve Sable, I would not be the big fan that I am. So, and Chris, and there's another guy you should have on, Chris Willis at NFL Films.
I would love to. I mean, that would be an amazing conversation, and of course you mentioned the legends himself, Steve Sable. NFL Films, I think, help expand the sport anyway.
It did.
As something that you can recognize, and and seeing people as more like heroes and icons, because that's kind of what they did. Is a great job telling the story within the game.
You hit on the head. They told the story, and it's always been compelling storytelling. Anytime you see an NFL. Even now with the modern stuff, like all the training camp stuff, that's very compelling. But with the stuff they did back in the beginning, like the John Facenda era, was really the era I'm talking about, because those were the gold standard. I at least once a week I listen to something from John Facenda. Always gives me chills. It's just the voice of God, So when we were talking about that, so when we were planning out the podcast, Scott and I are talking like, are we going to have to do? We're trying to line everything up. You got an intro, you got a trailer, and I told him, I go, I know a guy. He's like, what are you talking about? I go, I know a guy. So if you listen to our podcast, if you listen to the trailer's really good.
It is a very good trailer. I tuned into that just before we got on here. Excellent stuff. Great tease.
Yeah. Well, the guy who did the trailer is a guy I went to high school with.
Okay.
And I'm good friends with.
Hey.
And he's a guy by the name of George Washington III, and he is a voiceover artist who also is the voice of the Green Lantern on DC Universe's on DC Online Universe.
No kidding.
Yeah, and I grew up with George. I went to high school with him. I remember him as a little skinny kid. And I go, George, here's what I need. He goes, well, I'm not going to do John Facenda because I'll get sued, but I can come close. And like I heard it. I'm like, ooh, I'm getting chills. So, and I wrote out, and it was a thing of beauty. So that's kind of that whole starter, but just getting the podcast up and running. And so if you've listened to our podcast, it's very rough. I am not used to talking on, I'm still learning as I go along with the podcast in terms of not so much how to do the interview, but just to kind of get it up and rolling. In fact, the last podcast we had, it took like 4 takes for me to get it right because I kept just tripping over my words.
How do you think I feel? It's been it's been a learning process. I still am learning new things, I think, every week, man. Greg, that's for me too.
And that's the fun part about it, learning. And then there was that whole editing part where I had to learn how to put it all together.
Oh yeah.
And I'm like, well, I was going to have my 17-year-old nephew who's big into audio. He mixes stuff and everything. And I'm like, he's 17 years old. I'm not going to be able to count on him. So I'm like, I can figure this out myself. And sure enough, I did. So
nice.
It's using Audacity makes it real simple. And there's some great like yours and other guys. You guys do stuff that I just am not at that skill level yet. So for me, I just put the intro and then have the interview. And at the end, I have a little, at the end of every podcast, I throw in some either some fight song. So for the first one we did at the very end of our show, the Grey Cup song. And then the last show we did the Winnipeg Blue Bomber March.
Okay.
Well, for the upcoming shows, and we have coming up with any of the shows talking about football in Baltimore. And that's a subject which I love, just the whole Baltimore Colts story, the era. And, put at the end of every show, we talk about Baltimore, have the Baltimore Colts fight song.
Mm-hmm. Right. Hey, Ravens are I think they're still, the Ravens is the only team in the NFL that has a marching band as tradition from when the Colts were.
Right.
From when they had that back when Baltimore had the Colts at the time.
Yeah.
So,
well, there's
fascinating.
Have you seen the 30 for 30 documentary on the band?
No, I didn't even realize there was a documentary just on the band itself.
The title of the documentary is called "The Band That Wouldn't Die."
Oh no, wait. Yes, I've seen parts of this. Yes, I've seen parts of this documentary before.
Yeah, and there's another good documentary that just came out last year, "The Ghost of 33rd Street." And you're like me, you're from the Chicago, originally from the Chicago area. So there's a lot of, you watch stuff from that Baltimore Colts, and I see a lot of Chicago and, and because, there's a lot of love for the Bears.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people, as well as I, you get some really diehards in Chicago with the Bears. And so that history of football in Baltimore with the Colts to me has always been fascinating. In fact, if I had to go through my book collection, I would say, and there's a lot, but I would say if you have to pick a team that I've got the most history books about, it's probably the Baltimore Colts.
Well, yeah, hey, that 12-year battle just to get a, stable team that is back there
right
alone, that's something I've read up before too, and not as much on, say, like the Baltimore Stallions when they were there, but like just the constant struggle, losing out to expansion, even earlier in the years before 1996, like just,
Well, and if it weren't for the Stallions, and people say if it weren't for the Stallions, the Browns would have never moved, or the Browns would not have moved. I don't know about that, because I think the Browns had other options, but I think ultimately the Browns were going to go to Baltimore no matter what, whether there was a CFL team. But that CFL team in Baltimore, the CFL that was magic for that. That was the only successful CFL franchise in the States. And it was all about timing. You had the Orioles were on strike, and Major League Baseball was on strike in '94. So and also too the legal fight between the NFL and the CFL over the Colts name,
right,
added to that. So last year, a good friend of mine up in Canada sent me both seasons of the Baltimore Stallions. And so it's interesting to watch those games and watch those old games at Memorial Stadium, seeing Johnny Unitas on the sidelines, and just to see, the CFL. I mean, the CFL, your Grey Cup was going to be held in Baltimore, I think, in '96, and then obviously that all changed. So, just the history of just Baltimore and the Colts, but I don't know about you. You were too young to remember when the Colts moved. When the Browns moved to Baltimore.
I've read into it for sure, I've definitely seen documentaries on the '95 Cleveland Browns.
Right, and
plenty on that.
I remember when it all went down. I'm like, and you just, it's just like, man, yeah, it's great they're getting a team, but yeah, so
ripping that away.
Yeah, but I mean, the NFL has become big. I mean, such big business now and we kind of see what's happened with the NFL with stadiums. So kind of going back when we started talking about the Bears moving to Arlington Heights, I don't think you're going to see public funds going towards stadiums anymore.
It's going to get harder.
Yeah,
it's definitely going to get harder.
Yeah, and I don't know what it's like in Indiana in terms of the taxes and everything, but I know Illinois is not going to pay for Bear Stadium at this point.
Oh God. I mean, I'm still imagining, like, Jeff, as we wrap up, like, that's one thing I've thought about, like, even like looking at Oakland, looking at San Diego, like both those teams, the reason why they didn't get stadiums was the tax amounts would have been so astronomically high for the community that they just couldn't pass it. So anymore, you're starting to get to a plateau where it's like, well, how many more can you build to where the NFL now has to be like, well, or where the cities now have to say like, okay, you have the money, maybe you should start fronting more of it, instead of us doing that. Even though, yes, there's the finances and everything, and of course, the trade or the value that it brings to the community, but like, you can't keep fronting tax loads onto cities like that too. Yeah. Eventually, it kind of has to stop, or something.
And then when you get And I read, talking about that, I read a good book about arena. It's I forget the name of the book, but it's on stadiums. It's on arenas, and it talks about that very subject in terms of taxpayer funds. But when you have Jerry Jones and Stan Kroenke building stadiums completely with private funds, I think that's where we're going, because you're not going to get a stadium really any other way. Because you look at St. Louis. St. Louis is a good example where they put all those public funds towards getting an NFL team. And, I think I even remember, I wish I would have gone to a St. Louis Rams game, because there was part of me going, this team's going to leave eventually. And sure enough, they did. And you look, I mean, you're down in Indianapolis. So, and when the Colts had, from a business standpoint, moving from Memorial Stadium to Indianapolis was a smart move.
Yes.
Period. I mean, if you're a businessman, it's a smart move. But at the same time, I mean, you look at, what it's taken to keep the Colts there. If Indianapolis would have said no to a new stadium, the Colts would have moved somewhere else.
Right. Well, and you have to wonder too, like Manning's success here, at the time when the Colts were kind of a laughingstock in most of the '90s, with the exception of a few John Harbaugh season or Jim Harbaugh led seasons,
I went to the Hoosier Dome during the Jeff George era, so I get it.
Yes. Yes. Another name that, is a big what if in that era's history sometimes. Right. I wonder.
Still the best quarterback Illinois ever had, though.
Yeah, fair. Greg, it's been a pleasure. I seriously, I could talk to you all day, man. Yeah. I really could. And I think we should have another conversation at some point. Maybe even, like I said, maybe just NFL centric later in the year, or even more CFL. I mean, I love discussions like this. It's not often I get someone that talks history, or at least is as passionate about the history of the sport or either one of these leagues or various others, just like yourself. So can't thank you enough. I appreciate
thank you for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
It's no problem. Before I leave, where can we find you on social? I know you were talking about upcoming shows, but to be aware of where, of course, those that want to look out for your upcoming shows.
Right. So if you want to link so with our radio, so we've got a podcast from the 55-yard line, which is Scott and I talking to authors, but I also, and that's on the Sports History Network, but I also have another channel, which is CFL America Radio, where you get the interviews Scott and I do, plus you get audio documentaries that are in the public domain.
Okay.
And usually I try to put one out every day. Sometimes, it's just half hour. It's just stuff I've found. And it's usually, it centers around either Canadian or American football. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot in terms of Canadian football documentaries out there. Mm-hmm. So you're going to get a mixture of everything. Just recently, I posted something about the old Pottstown Firebirds, if you know the story about that team.
Oh.
It was a minor league football team out in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. And it's free. It's the great thing about the internet is it's all free, and I enjoy putting that stuff out there for others to listen to. So in terms of where you can find me, it's at CFL America on Twitter. And there's links to everything. And my co-host is Scott Adamson. It's Adamson SL on Twitter. And then if you want to go to the Sports History Network, it's at Sports History HQ on Twitter.
Give this guy, give the other accounts and his co-host a follow. Really, he's a pleasure. He is definitely one that supports those out there like myself that, just love the game in general. So seriously, Greg, thank you very much. Can't say thanks enough. I wish you the best. I'm looking forward to future stuff from you. And
I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Exactly. I'm looking forward to it. Greg James, everybody. Greg, thank you very much. Have a great evening.
You too. Thanks.
The Gridiron Gallery Podcast. New episodes every Friday on your favorite podcast platforms, YouTube, and premiering first, as always, at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, only on unhingedsn.com.